Hey everyone, if you tuned into the fights this past weekend, you are obviously now well aware of the fact that Frankie got knocked the fuck out by Brian Ortega in pretty devastating fashion, right? Got hit with a nice elbow and then a beautiful uppercut that literally lifted Edgar off his feet. And the question now kind of becomes, what's next for Frankie, right? Because does he stay at 145? Does he retire? Does he move to 135? Like, what road does he take next? And there's problems with all of them. And I think the most obvious thing that we can conclude after this past weekend is that Brian Ortega is going to fight Max Holloway for the title, right? He's earned that. That makes sense. That's probably the fight that they're going to make. But you've got guys like Jeremy Stephens, who has been on an absolute tear, and if he can fight a guy like Jose Aldo and pick up a win, he's going to have a legitimate argument that he should fight for the title. Like, he's earned that right. And the problem with that, though, is Frankie's beat Jeremy Stephens, right? So, very confusing. The problem with Frankie retiring is that Frankie probably mauls 90% of the 145-pound division, and he's already proven to you that he can do that. He's never lost a non-title fight at 145. The only man he's ever lost to is Jose Aldo up until this past weekend when he lost to Ortega. He's a world-class fighter. He's just having trouble getting over that hump that gets him the title. And the problem with 135 is when you go to 135, Frankie's old. I would like him cutting that weight if he was younger in his career, but Frankie's not getting any younger, man. Time catches up to you, and I think that cut is going to be extremely rough for him, and I don't think he wants to make it. Also, I think his teammate Moraes fights down there, right? Like, I don't think there's any doubt that Frankie can move to 135 and be competitive. The problem is if he wants to put his body through that just to move down to a weight class when he's extremely competitive at 145. And here's my opinion on what I think should happen. And I'm obviously incredibly biased because I love Frankie Edgar, right? He qualified for nationals all 4 years that he went to Clarion. We didn't go to school at the same time, but I went to Clarion too. So I have a hard time not liking the guy and rooting for him. But I think that what you do with Frankie is you give him a guy who's coming off a loss like Josh Emmett. I think Frankie Edgar versus Josh Emmett makes a lot of sense. And if Frankie's able to beat Josh Emmett, and so I think there's a few fights that have to happen here, and there's a lot of ifs going on here. Like, I'm doing a lot of speculating. I don't think Frankie's going to move to 135. I really don't think you'll see it. I don't think he wants to make that cut. I don't think he's going to retire because he still feels that he's competitive. I think that you're going to see Holloway and Ortega fight. And then Stephens and Aldo are going to fight. And then Edgar and Emmett should fight. A lot of ifs here. If Frankie beats Emmett, and if Holloway beats Ortega, I think that Frankie and Max Holloway should fight. Because that sounds crazy, right? But MMA math doesn't work. And just because Ortega beat Edgar and lost to Holloway doesn't mean that Edgar will lose to Holloway. Because if you look at the fight that Frankie had against Rodriguez went around Frankie's neck at one point, like tried to look up a guillotine when they were standing, and Frankie said, fuck that, I'm just going to take you down. Like, I'm that confident in my wrestling that you are not going to be able to submit me. If you watch the fight this past weekend, Ortega wraps his hand around Frankie's neck, and Frankie's like, oh, no, I don't want to fuck with that, and gets out of doesn't try to complete the takedown. And when you take away Frankie's forte is wrestling, right? Like, don't get me wrong, he's a very good boxer, and he was dotting Ortega up for a majority of that round until he got clipped. But Frankie wants to resort to wrestling. It's what he's good at, and it's what he's best at, right? And when you take that away from him, you have nullified the thing that he's best at. And the way that Ortega beat Frankie has kind of been the story of Ortega's UFC career so far. Patience, right? Ortega wasn't winning that round, but when he landed it, when that opening came, he capitalized on it, and then he exercised patience even in the finish when he had to land the uppercut. Frankie gets clipped a lot, make no mistake. Like, Frankie's been hurt a lot in his career. But if you look at Gray Maynard, perfect example, in their second fight, when Gray Maynard clipped Frankie, and fighters do this all across the board. It's not just guys who fight Frankie. It's not just this fight. It's not just, when they hurt someone, they put their foot on the gas and they're going 100 miles an hour to try to finish you. And when you do that, you create these mad scrambles that for whatever reason, Frankie's able to survive in. Like, when you put him in that situation and you're running like everything's crazy and hectic, Frankie thrives in that. Like, he thrives at getting back. He thrives at getting his feet back underneath him. But Ortega, when he hit that elbow, Didn't do that at all. He didn't start swarming him and getting crazy. Sense of urgency, right? But collected, calm urgency is the way I like to phrase that. He picked the shots, hit him with the uppercut, and turned Frankie's lights out. But anyway, to get back to what we were talking about earlier with Styles making fights, Holloway, he's obviously he's legitimate on the ground, right? Like, he has submission wins in his arsenal. Like, he can do it all. But Holloway's not going to be as good off his back as Ortega is, plain and simple. He's just not. So if Frankie fights Holloway, his takedowns come back to him, right? Like, it opens up a whole new doorway for him in that fight. Like, you got to fight a different fight against Holloway than you fight against Ortega. And Holloway's a guy, too, who relies on pressure. And he's a really hard guy to time, and he's pushing forward a lot of the time and putting a pace on you that you really can't keep up with. And Ortega's kind of the opposite. He's kind of like waiting for you to come to him, and he's trying to figure you out, and he'll accept that pressure if it means that he's going to get to land that big shot. Clay Guida fight, perfect example. If that goes to the judges, he probably loses. But he lands that perfectly timed knee. He's got like 4 third-round finishes, so he's a pro at that. Anyway, long story short, I think there's a lot happening at 145. I don't think you'll see Frankie retire, and I don't think you'll see him move to 135. So I think that what happens at 145 is you make Frankie fight a guy like Emmett, you let Stevens and Aldo fight, and if Ortega beats Holloway, let the winner of Stevens-Aldo fight Ortega. That's fine. But if Holloway wins and Frankie wins, Frankie has a tiebreaker over Stevens if Stevens can beat Aldo. This is, like I said, I'm doing a ton of speculating here, and if Aldo beats Stevens, it doesn't really matter, right? Because Aldo's already beat Frankie twice. So he'll probably get a title shot against Ortega. But what if... Okay, so think about this, though. It leads us to this, right? Sorry, this is very confusing. I know I'm confusing myself. What if Aldo fights Stevens and beats Stevens, but Holloway beats Ortega, and Frankie beats a guy like Emmett? You don't want to make Aldo fight Holloway, and you don't want to make Aldo fight Frankie Edgar, because you've already seen those play out, and both of them have happened twice, right? So what do? Give a guy like Cub Swanson the title shot against Holloway? Maybe I don't know what to do there. There's a lot going on, but in short, I think that what should happen is Frankie should fight Josh Emmett and see what plays out from there, I guess. Is long story short, right? Without doing a lot of speculating. Let's do Stevens versus Aldo. Let's do Holloway Ortega, and let's do Edgar Emmett, and just let it play out from there and figure it all out, because it's a mess right now. Let me know what you guys think. Agree, disagree, opinions, thoughts, whatever. Let me know. Thank you.